Good afternoon and welcome everyone. ATSA is pleased to have you join us today. Today's webinar is hosted by the ATSA Training Department and the Roadway Worker Safety Council. My name is Donna Clark and I will be your moderator for today's Safety Supports webinar, which is the third in our series. Today's webinar will be 45 minutes in length. We ask that you keep your line muted during the webinar unless you are speaking. If during the webinar you have a question or a comment, we ask that you utilize the Q&A feature. I would now like to introduce today's speaker, Alex Kelly of Salt & Company. Alex, take it away. We look forward to hearing what you have to talk about today.
Thank you so much, Donna, and thank you so much to everybody for joining today. I'm really excited to be with all of you today. As Donna mentioned, today's topic is about safety supports. And you would have seen this in our ATSA sort of reminder email, but really this topic is about planning for a safety incident, even though it's not something we really want to think about, but it can and will happen. So the important thing here is to think about these steps and how to support your team effectively before things ever happen, so that you're really prepared to move through that process with grace and tact. I will start things off like I did my last webinar with just a bit of a content warning, really from my heart to yours, because I know that in this industry, we're all working with a lot of lived experience about these types of issues, whether it's a roadside fatality of an employee, a colleague, or traumatic injury, something like that. And while we won't be delving too much into details, we will be touching on some of it. And I wanted to acknowledge that for some people, it may be fresh or just maybe too much for them at this time. And I really encourage you to take the steps to protect your mental and your emotional health. And this presentation can always be made available at a later date. I'll share it with Donna, and I'm always happy to kind of give a private walkthrough if anybody wants. So if you want to step away today, we can always come back to it. And I will acknowledge ATSA colleague Cal Byer for this one. I thought it was beautiful at the convention, and I just wanted to integrate it here today. So if today is not your day, completely understand, and I encourage you to take care. So for today's presentation, we're going to be talking about what I like to call the safety support continuum, because I believe that safety supports aren't just one thing that happen after an incident. It's a whole workplace sort of change or state of mind. So with that, we're going to talk about proactive planning. We're going to talk about next steps. We're also going to touch a little bit in between there on effective incident response, which is actually a presentation that I did in March. So I don't want to repeat everything for everybody, but do know that this is part of that continuum. And then a final note, and then we'll move into safety blind spot blueprint, which I always just throw in there if you ever want to continue this sort of discussion. And you'll see here on the screen this image of the safety supports checklist. I've actually consolidated everything that we are going to talk about here today into a checklist that I'm happy to send out to anybody afterwards. So I'll go through that at the end of our presentation. So a little bit about me. So just so you know who's kind of on the other side of this, I am a road safety and transportation strategist. I come from a very different background than a lot of you, in that my sort of education is around public health and injury prevention. And so that's given me a really unique perspective when chatting with ATSA folks to look at it from a different perspective. I'm a very proud member of the Roadway Worker Protection Council with ATSA, and I encourage all of you to really get on track with what's happening there, because there's some phenomenal work being done. In terms of my experience in this space, just for a little bit of credibility, led Canada's first Vision Zero Advocate Institute. I am based in Canada. And I've worked with a number of different clients across the road safety, work safety, ride sharing, insurance, nonprofit, public, private, all of them. So again, just adding to those experience points. And really, I look at this from how do we create a good strategy, have good communications, and work in partnership with each other. That's my main goal. Also, as you can see the picture, curly hair, straight hair, it's a thing. It's summer and it's humid. So like I mentioned, part one of this presentation was presented in March, and that was really about effective incident response. And the infographic on the right-hand side of your screen is sort of, again, a summary of what we talked about there and what really has to happen in those first critical hours and days after an incident. And so this kind of expands or bookends that presentation with what you can do before and after that initial incident. However, of course, if you want to see the presentation or the infographic, again, I'll have my email at the end. More than happy to share it with you just to sort of knit everything together. And actually, maybe I'll include that incident response piece in our checklist for today, so you have it all in one package. Okay, so safety supports continuum. So when we're talking today about safety supports, it's really creating an effective, supportive environment for your staff in the event of an incident. And so an incident, remember, can be big or small. It can be a catastrophic injury that leads to loss of life, loss of limb, or a major debilitating injury that will change the course of somebody's life forever. And of course, when we have those sorts of incidents, we see a massive ripple effect throughout their family, their community, their workplace, and it really does have long-lasting impacts. We also see issues or incidents in other capacities as well. So we won't be touching on it in the same sort of context today, but I do think it's worth reminding that also traumatic incidents can happen in terms of your workplace closure or due to an environmental incident like an earthquake or flooding. Maybe there is an act of violence in the workplace, or maybe something's happened to a subset of your employees that has elicited a traumatic response as well. So there's a lot of different things that can happen in our professional life or our personal life that can lead to some sort of traumatic experience or some sort of lack of safety. And so there's, again, a big array of things that we could talk about, but for our purposes here today, we're really focusing on, the roadside workers and the road safety industry or the transportation industry, and some of the common injuries and causes of death that are related to that exact industry. So again, that's a bit of my preamble here. So when I look at the safety supports, like I mentioned off the top, I really see this as a continuum, or you could even see it as a cycle. And it starts with proactive planning and then moving through effective incident response after an incident occurs, and then next steps coming out of that response period. And so for right now, excuse me, we're going to talk about the proactive planning piece. So this happens before there's ever even the chance of an incident on the horizon, just to, again, make sure that you're doing everything possible to set your staff up for success. So really, when we look at proactive planning, and proactive means you're doing it before the event, so it's a bit of a double there, proactive planning, but we're really looking at how you can take critical ideas, planning, risk mitigation strategies, and discuss them in a safe environment, in a safe container, in a more hypothetical situation, as opposed to trying to figure it out in the real world. So that's like what I said before about how it starts before the incident ever occurs. And really, this helps your workers perform the best they can in the middle of an incident. So remember, when we talk about incidents, there's the first initial thing that may happen, but then you need your staff to be supported by protocols that keep them safe throughout the aftermath as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. And my thing coming from, the public health and injury prevention world is I love the research. And so for this, I dove into the research to look at really what happens and why it's important to really set up protocols and procedures beforehand to support our safety at work. So I'll talk about that a little bit too. So, like I mentioned, I like the research. So let's talk about biology. What happens when your body goes into sort of a stress response? And again, not to sort of limit us too much in terms of what we're talking about here today, but rather to acknowledge sort of the bigger context when we're talking about stress, is we all have stress in our daily life. There's stress when you're running late for work, or maybe you're not ready for that meeting with your boss. And then there's also stress that we see right now. So, certainly COVID has brought its own set of challenges. People are worried about job security. People are worried about social, political events around the world. So there's a lot of different things that can impact our stress. But when we're talking about a critical incident or traumatic incident, that triggers a whole different kind of stress response. So if you can see in this image of the brain, we've got the amygdala, which is this tiny little piece, like a peanut in your brain. And that is where all of your emotional response and emotional processing happens. And so that's kind of like the canary in the coal mine that says, hey, we're under stress right now. We need to do something to make sure that we can protect ourselves and preserve our functioning. So the amygdala actually sends a distress signal when there is an incident. So if maybe you're on the job site and somebody gets hurt, or there's a truck that barrels through a road closure, or there's a collapse of a building, or something traumatic happens. If you're somebody who's on site and you witness it, or you're in the middle of that emergency situation, your amygdala sends that distress signal to your hypothalamus, which is really your command center of your brain. And that's where your brain is triggered to say, okay, we need to preserve our function right now. We need to make sure that, breathing is optimized and blood circulation is optimized. And so your heart starts to beat faster. Maybe your fingers get a little bit cool because your body is trying to conserve blood in the core. You are really ready for that fight or flight mechanism. And so the important thing here, and the whole reason I wanted to start with this, is that when you're in that kind of fight or flight response and your brain is, short-circuiting, trying to protect you, things like your decision-making and your executive functions can be compromised. So even if you weren't personally injured yourself in the incident, if you need to respond in any sort of way, whether it's moving equipment, administering first aid, bringing in first responders, calling 911, figuring out the phone tree that somebody figured out at your office, all of that becomes more difficult to process. And so that's why when we talk about proactive planning, it's making sure that we're giving things enough repetition and routine and training so that your body can go into sort of autopilot. And even though your body or your brain is reacting to this stressful situation, you still know what to do because it's been re-emphasized over and over to you. The other thing here that we talk about when we look at our beautiful brain and what happens when we're stressed is that you may not react as quickly. So even if you are in a job site and, potentially there is potential for an incident, or somebody is barreling down on you or texting and driving and doesn't see your flagger, if again, you kind of freeze in the moment because you haven't really walked through the steps of what to do, your reaction time may be delayed. You may forget that key protocol. And then you may not be aware of your surroundings and you may have a secondary impact or a risk. So that's like one of the things when we see people get into a car crash on a highway like the image here, oftentimes people's response when they get in a car crash is to get out of the car. And then all of a sudden you're out of the car on like a 6-lane highway and cars are still racing by you at 60 miles an hour. So we need to really provide that backup information for your body so that you don't, open yourself up to more risk and lose critical time, whether it's for first aid or response time or things like that. So how does that play into our workers? So one of the things that's really important, and when we talk about safety and risks, a lot of times people don't want to think about the worst thing that could happen to them. That's as one of my bosses used to say, a sophisticated response to fear is denial. Nobody wants to think about the worst day of their life. However, it's really important to talk about the possibility of an incident and go through what could happen to find opportunities to make it safer, and as well allow people time in a more relaxed environment to figure out what they would do and how they would react. So it allows teams to default to training, have a clear protocol to follow, mitigate those secondary risks like I talked about, and allow for bigger plans to take shape. So when we look at what that looks like at an operational level within a company, again, we're trying to create that support system for them. It's empowering your health and safety committees. And I know in every company and jurisdiction that's maybe called by a different name, joint health and safety committee, a safety consultant you may have come in and help your committee. There's a lot of different sort of names that we could go by here, but it's really empowering a health and safety committee to do their job well. And we'll talk about that. Hosting regular training on protocol and operations and having actual buy-in for people. Developing resilient teams, which I'll talk about a little bit more, it's part of the research, and engaging resources ahead of time, just in case you ever need them, with the hopes that you don't need them. So our health and safety committees. This is one of the most important components of your organization, and I strongly believe that they should always have a seat at the senior table, but represent every level of staff to help foster buy-in and also give real-world experience. Your committee should be empowered to really analyze risks and develop mitigation plans, irregardless of cost to the company or cost to delivery of a job or a product or something like that. Health and safety is paramount. And so you really need to empower the committee and not just have it be a tick box as part of your operational plans, but really give them the power to make changes. They also need to look at those near misses and incidents to develop policies. There's a lot of really deep learning that we can have when you have somebody who almost gets hurt or, almost lost an eye or almost got hit by a car. All of those things are really important, and fostering a really open and communicative environment in your, in your organization helps those near misses be shared and discussed and brought to a place where they can actually be addressed. Creating safe work practices and procedures is critical as well. So it's working with your health and safety team to actually walk through all of the potentials and what could happen and what could go wrong, and creating that clear understanding of procedure so that when something does happen, or if it happens, there's no trying to figure it out on the side of the road or in the executive office. There is just a procedure that you can just take and run with. Health and safety is also really important because it helps you understand how to support your staff through compliance obligations. So whether it's an incident investigator that has to come out or an inspector that's coming out on a more proactive piece. But again, understanding how you can utilize those resources to the best of their ability. And then as well, building relationships with key decision makers. I mentioned this off the top of having a seat at the table for your health and safety committee, but it really is important that senior leadership, as well as departmental management staff, have those keen relationships, but that also your health and safety team is hearing from everybody in the organization. So even if it's the most junior level, entry level, brand new summer flagger, how can you engage them in your health and safety committee or process to understand some of the risks that they see? There may be something that you aren't seeing because it's been 10, 15, 20 years since you've worked in the field. You need that fresh perspective to fold into your other plans. And I've also got here a wonderful resource, the hierarchy of controls. And this is, again, just a reminder when we're looking at health and safety, if we're really trying to protect our people, what are all of the levers that we have to make the most safe environment possible? So it goes kind of, it's an inverted triangle, if you will, but obviously you want to focus on eliminating the risk first and foremost, substituting it for replacing the hazard rather, looking at engineering controls to just keep people from the hazard, changing the way people work through administrative controls, and finally providing people with personal protective equipment. But that should be a last resort because it is the least effective. If we can protect people through some of those higher levels, the research shows it's a much better outcome. And so that's, again, something that you need to look at with your health and safety committee and empowering them to make those suggestions and to make real change to address some of the risks and the hazards that exist within your workplace. And sometimes I will say that some of these solutions and controls are outside of your job. So maybe it's, outside of your organization. So maybe it's working within other organizations or committees or like ATSA to look at what's on the horizon for engineering controls to make a safer workplace. So there's a lot in that health and safety committee that we can use. We also need to look at training. So I know that training is mandatory for most, if not all of us, on some aspect of our job. But it's really important to have a strong commitment to training and not just do it again to tick a box. It's also important to really look at what you're training on. So there's the workplace tasks. How do you operate this machinery? What's the proper setup and teardown protocol for this element? How do you move several pieces of equipment throughout a warehouse or onto a job site? But you also need to think about what you're training on when it comes to incident response. Again, this is where we're really trying to make those pathways in our brain that we can just rely on in an instant as a reflex. So what are you going to do if somebody gets hurt, somebody gets killed? What are you going to do if there's a collision on your job site? How can we start to walk through that and really, again, ingrain in people what the proper protocol is? The other important thing is it's not a one and done kind of situation. Refreshing your training regularly with all of the staff from top to bottom and back again is critical. It helps you to account for seasonal changes. So if you have somebody who starts in winter and you live in Michigan, you're going to have a very different first day on your job than somebody who starts their job in July in Michigan. So how do you train for snow? How do you train for summer? What changes? Are we taking into account extra clothing people are wearing, different types of boots, visibility, changes in, when the sun sets, all of that sort of thing? Think about, does your training actually accommodate that, or do you need some more support? Operational updates. How does your company do business? If the people who've been there for 10, 20 years were trained in one way, but now your operation has changed substantially, are they still up to date on it? And again, this is the workplace tasks, but also incident response. So maybe when somebody started at a company 10, 15 years ago, maybe it wasn't company policy to give a cell phone in case of emergency, but now it is. So are we appropriately using that resource in an appropriate way to provide a staff support if there is an incident so they can respond? And then finally, staffing turnover. And I know some positions change more regularly, seasonally positions change more regularly, but how are we accounting for that and training our new employees, but also training our employees that are moving up within the organization? So again, how do we address what their workplace tasks, but also if their role in the entire incident response changes, how are we addressing that too? And when we're doing our research for this presentation, one of the things that really stuck out to me as a quote was somebody at the head of an organization was talking about the importance of executive buy-in and how they needed to consistently test knowledge and response at all levels of the company regularly. And it does say something if your senior leadership is sitting in that training as well, side by side with the newest kid on the block, doing that training and understanding exactly what's happening. That really provides a bit more credibility within the organization, and people start to take safety more seriously. The other thing that I would add for training as part of our staff supports is mental health first aid training. And it's called a couple of different things depending on where you live. But mental health first aid training is a wonderful course. I've done it in the past, and I'm happy to provide resources afterwards. But it allows you to actively respond to somebody who's having a mental health crisis, identify the sort of warning signs if they are, and help them to find professional help should they need it. And when we're looking at an incident and sort of that aftermath of a response, everybody's runway for grief and mental health is different, especially after a traumatic event. And so equipping your team with mental health first aid training ahead of time allows them to be more in tune with what could be happening within the organization. The third piece I wanted to talk about when we look at the proactive planning is the idea of resilient teams. And this is critical for organizational function. And I've popped an article up here and I've linked it in the slide deck because it really is a great literature review of the importance of resiliency in corporate teams. And when I talk about resilience, this is the ability to adapt well in times of stress, trauma, and threats. Of course, nobody's going to get a gold star for how they deal with a trauma, but it allows you to, see a little bit more clearly and react appropriately. And the thing is when we're looking at a critical incident or a traumatic event, it can impair employee performance and really contribute to serious mental or physical strain. So we see that in the incident and then in the aftermath as well. And resiliency can be a very powerful tool. And it's one of those soft skills that's definitely overlooked, but it can be essential for effective teamwork in a critical response situation as well. I didn't put this in here to mitigate potential risks as well. So how does this happen? So if we want to look at a resilient team, so that one that can really work together and adapt to hardships, as you can see in this rowboat graphic we've got here, there's a few different things that you want to cultivate. And again, this is a long road approach. You want to have candor. So how can people have open and honest dialogue and feedback with each other? How do you have resourcefulness so people can face challenges together and come together with creative and effective solutions? How does compassion and empathy factor into your day-to-day performance? So caring about each other in both success and failure. And humility, asking for or allowing comfort and asking for accepting help from others on the team. And you may be looking at this and you're like, Alex, like I've had an incident, unfortunately, in my operation. And, you know, the last thing we need is humility on the side of the road when we're trying to figure out ambulances and road closures and stuff like that. Like this is a little soft. And I get it. However, if you have a resilient team that has all of these four components, the opportunity there is that you have a team that's already discussing things together. They feel comfortable with one another. They feel okay if they maybe screw up because they know they won't be ridiculed. And that's really important when you have somebody who maybe sees something that's wrong on the side of the road, or there's a red flag in the operations. And instead of feeling like the stupid one for saying something, or feeling like they're going to get laughed at or mocked, they actually feel like they have enough strength and trust in their team to bring something up, which could lead to you getting a near miss instead of an actual incident. So it not only helps in the instant of an issue where you know you have a strong team that can work together and come together and talk about what's happened in an incident afterwards, but it also helps you in your risk mitigation for people to feel supported to raise that red flag. And then the final piece for proactive planning is engaging those resources that I talked about previously. And we'll talk a little bit about them at the sort of the back nine of the presentation. But one of the things that I've seen in a lot of critical incidents is that people are at a loss. Who do you call? What do you do? What do you say? How do you support people? What should you not say? And, you know, the thing is here is that you always want to sort of have it in your back pocket, have an idea of what that network looks like. So the first one is employee assistance programs. And I know a lot of us here have these already in place. And the one thing that I would say and take away from today is, does your program include crisis counseling? Is that something you're actively paying for? Or is that something that if an incident did occur, you'd find out the hard way that isn't covered in your coverage? You also want to look at what you have to do with respect to incident reporting for obligations with local authorities. So does the state officials have to come in and investigate, for example? Grief counselor contacts, who is in your network? Who could you call? And would they be available? And is that a 24-hour thing? Is it a 9 to 5? Did they do group counseling? Did they do one-on-one? Who are they, so that you have those names ready to go? Because those first few hours and days are really critical for your staff to be able to process what's happened. And then safety and risk management consulting firms. And I know there's been a lot of great work in some of the ATSA magazines and talking about this. And I know there's a number of consulting firms just like this in our network within ATSA. But again, these are professional firms that can help you walk through the worst case scenarios side by side so that you can figure out what you would do and have a plan and be able to activate it very easily. So now we get into the next step of our continuum, and it's that effective incident response. And like I said off the top, I'm not going to go too deeply into this because we did work on we did our presentation in March on that. And again, I'll share it with you. But I just wanted to pull up these two images because I know they resonated with the group last time. So first of all, coordinated response to a work zone incident. As you can see by all the colors and all of the kind of different pieces of that diagram on the left, there's a lot going on. And so that's why we gave incident response its own sort of breathing room in terms of a presentation to talk about this. But again, knowing that there's so many different pieces of the puzzle here and so many different actors, so that if you have that proactive plan in place ahead of time, it'll help you move through something that could be very intimidating, very overwhelming, with much more grace. It's still not going to be easy, but it will help you to just be a little bit more planned to address what's happening. And then of course we've got our do, say, need, and debrief, which really boils down our incident response presentation from last time. So then we get to our next steps. And I have to admit, when I was sort of developing this presentation and thinking about the different steps of this continuum, I struggled with what to call this, because it's a difficult thing to move on, but it is sort of the passage of time. And so we have to kind of look at these as almost insulated components within our continuum. And sort of where do we go from here, I would say, is kind of what next steps means to me, with the utmost respect and compassion. So this is when we're talking about kind of, after the immediacy of an incident has been dealt with, how do we take that to the next level and continue on? We know that in supporting an organizational team after a critical incident, it takes a long road approach. And I didn't choose this graphic on the side by accident. It's a lot of confusing curves and whatnot within that long road approach, but it really requires professional help for support, a training integration, and as well, how do we honor the employee and their family in a meaningful way? So professional health, and this sort of dovetails rather with our proactive planning piece, but really, again, making sure that you've got the correct people in the correct spaces to support your organization in the best way possible. So it's really how you support them through difficult times. So grief counselors who can offer both group and individual sessions, and they can also help guide you on the best sort of format and venue for those as well. There's the activation and promotion of the employee assistance programs. And I say promotion there very deliberately, because EAP is something that you can make available, but of course you can never force somebody to attend that, or grief counseling. You can only do your utmost best to forward those contacts and meeting dates and other resources to them, and allow them to make that choice for themselves. And then of course, you can also work with professional debriefers to really work through what happened in the incident, to understand all of those moving parts, and also to provide some sort of closure within your team. And professional debriefers can be very, very important, because a lot of times when there's an incident, there's a lot of guilt, there's a lot of potentially blame. People are unsure of what really happened, and your brain starts to kind of create work to fill in the gaps sometimes when it doesn't have the complete information, especially when we look at traumatic events. And so debriefing it in a really safe and controlled way can be helpful to give your team the closure that they need, and also understand with clarity the exact sequence of events as they happened. Like I mentioned previously, we always want to make sure that we research these resources before they're required and know the rollout plan. So again, sometimes depending on what you're looking at, you may want people there in the hours after, you may want people there in the days after. You may want to look at kind of a 30, 60, 90-day plan for some of these support systems. So how do you really make sure that you've got it under control and you know how it works? Also, like I mentioned previously, understanding that EAP coverage and the logistics. So do you have the crisis counseling piece? How often can people use EAP? What other things do you have in your benefits plan that supports counseling or other mental health facilities? And then it's, again, continuing to make those resources available to staff and known. People's sort of bandwidth for how they deal with grief is different, and it takes time, and nobody is on a schedule when it comes to this. And so somebody may be processing things very rapidly afterwards, and somebody may take a long time to process. So maybe in the weeks or months afterwards. And you see this oftentimes when, you know, everybody will be fine, and then something happens. Maybe it's a holiday season, or there's sort of an annual tradition at the workplace or something like that. And bam, it hits them, and they hadn't thought about it for months. And now it hits them again, and they realize, holy smokes, I haven't worked through all of this. And this is as well, professional help can be supplemented by that mental health first aid piece to, again, be able to, especially if you're a leader within the organization, to be able to just kind of pick up the pulse of what's happening within the company. And, you know, again, just continuing to make those resources available, or be able to facilitate a conversation if it does come up with some of your staff. The next piece is training integration. And this is an important one because, especially in the injury prevention world and transportation, it's critical that we learn from the incident. That's why we have a black box in planes. We want to know what happened so that we can build planes and change operation protocols to support best practice. And so that's where, you know, you really want to debrief the incident with the Health and Safety Committee and your trainers. And if you work with an external training body, that's also when you want to have that debrief with them as well. So this doesn't just adhere to people who have internal training capacity. It's critical to understand those root causes of the incident and identify where those potential gaps are for improved training. And this can be a little bit difficult sometimes because people may not want to talk about what happened, or they don't want to talk about a mistake that maybe somebody who's deceased made, or they just would really rather just shove it under the rug and move on. And oftentimes in corporate culture, sometimes we'll see that there is a propensity to be secretive about an incident because it may feel like, you know, a tarnish on a reputation or bad PR or something like that. And really with training, we need to present those factual answers to really understand what happened so that it never happens again. And when we're talking about our victims and really wanting to honor them in the best way possible, incorporating what happened to them into a training is a way to make sure that we're learning from what happened to them and respecting the loss of life appropriately. It's also important to really look at incorporating that incident, and I'm kind of being a little bit repetitive here, but really incorporating that incident into our training. So not that it's just kind of once we mention it and then we move on, but really continually coming back to it. It becomes part of your corporate history, whether you like it or not. And it really can be that inflection point for people to change their behavior so a similar incident is never repeated, but also convey the gravity of the situation and what your organization has gone through and how committed you are to safe work practices now and forever. And so really it's critical to make that part of your DNA, even if you don't want. We grow by learning, even if it's uncomfortable. And then finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention honoring the employee. And this is a really important piece for not only the family of an employee if they've died, or maybe they've had a tragic injury that they're no longer able to come back to work, but it also provides closure for the employees who are still at the organization. And this is something that really, when we're talking about grace and tact, has to be approached with both of those to the utmost effect. So it's working with the family to understand an appropriate time in an appropriate way, and really letting family lead the way on this one. And sometimes it may look like an event to commemorate the individual, or planting a tree, or dedicating a bench to commemorate them. The physical reminder can be very comforting for people. It could be something like creating a scholarship in their honor or donating to a charity in their name. And I know within the context of ATSA and the foundation, we see this and we're reminded of it. And, you know, for other people, this is again, a tangible way to connect back into the person and the experience and really commit to doing better in honor of that person. And again, like I said previously, this is really about creating that closure for the team so that they can move forward and remember somebody in a positive way. And then finally, really it's looking at checking in. So right now, more than ever, I would say with economic uncertainty and, you know, the job market and things like that, there's a lot of pressure to return to normal. People want that stability, they want their compensation, they're worried about losing their job. So what may happen in these sorts of incidents is that you have staff coming back to work when maybe it's not optimal for them, but they feel like they must, or they feel a certain comfort in coming back to work because being at home is just too much for them right now. And so like I mentioned previously, everybody's grief cycle is different timeline, different signs and symptoms. Somebody may cry, somebody may be more chatty, somebody may be more reserved. All of these things are very individual and based on the person. People may have lingering PTSD or depression, and they may not have the awareness to recognize it, or they may not want to recognize it formally. And so this is really important to recognize in those days, weeks, and even months when people are coming back to work. And again, knowing the seasonal nature of our work, or of our jobs and transportation, if something happened at the end of maybe the summer season, and then we have a whole year that goes by, and then we come back in May for that summer construction season, you know, that may have that trigger point in the year that you weren't expecting, and it just hits you like a load of bricks. And so that's where returning to work may present a new crisis and a cycle of stress triggers. So maybe it's a seasonal piece, or maybe somebody took a considerable amount of time off, and coming back and seeing coworkers may be really difficult. So that's where it's really critical to continue to check in with teams and provide resources on an ongoing basis. And also it's important to recognize that grief can really impact job readiness. So you may need to look at how you can reassign some of your staff or create different return to work plans. So maybe they're working in a different capacity for a while. And this all falls true for people who maybe were on site, or maybe work closely with somebody who is involved in an incident, or somebody who is critically injured themselves and has taken the time to rehabilitate and come back. But this may also trigger a lot of different trauma responses within them. And then finally, one of the last supports that we like to offer and look at is the whole concept of psychological safety. And this is, you know, typically something that lies in the realm with human resources, but really psychological safety is the ability to show and employ oneself without fear of negative consequences of self-image, status, or career. And so, you know, we may see that people come back and they've got a real stiff upper lip. They don't want to talk about it. They're fine. But they may be scared of breaking down at work. They may feel that they're going to mess up, or that they can't talk about what happened. And so we really need to create the opportunities in those safe places to allow people to feel safe enough to talk about what they're feeling at work as it relates to this trauma or what have you. And so that's where we've got this fearless organization scan. So some great questions to ask yourself or senior leadership. To what degree is it permissible to make mistakes? Will people get teased if they screw up? To what degree can difficult and sensitive topics be discussed openly? Or will people be bullied for being, you know, a sissy or weak? How much are people willing to help one another? So again, do we have that team that's resilient and working together, or are people really isolated in silos? And sometimes you see these changes in group dynamics after an incident. So maybe they were a great team before, and now everybody just seems to be at odds with one another. So what's happening not only in the individual, but the group dynamic? And then what degree can you be yourself and are welcomed for it? And this organization scan is really a broad basing one. So you may not feel like it's, again, a best fit for this sort of incident, but just think about the environment that you're cultivating. And if somebody is feeling more vulnerable about coming back because they've been through such trauma, how can we make sure that we actually have an environment that they want to come back to, that they feel safe in? And that's a mental, psychological safety, not necessarily what we traditionally talk about, physical safety. And then I shared this in my last presentation, but my final note to everybody is take care. So, all of this is, supremely stressful. And when you're responding to an incident or just working through your proactive planning or even those next step pieces, it can be really heavy yourself to work through yourself. And sometimes when you're in a leadership position or you've joined this call for a reason today, so you're obviously very interested in enacting change and evolving your organization in a positive way, sometimes we forget to think about ourselves. And so we've got this image of helping somebody put their own oxygen mask on after they put their own on. And so it's really making sure that whether you're part of the deployment team or the senior leadership team, you're taking care of yourself. So stress relieving activities, being mindful of your own change in habits, talking to people, and really taking care of yourself. So again, just a reminder, because I know that even this presentation is a lot to take in. So it's really carving out that time to allow your brain and your body to come down from that high stress response. Now, I know we're kind of at the top of our time. I always throw this in here at the end. It's really, if you want to chat more about kind of how we figure out where the blind spots are in your organization around safety, we can always chat about that. But really, I think the most important thing for me today is if you are interested in this checklist, I'm happy to email it to anybody. If you just send me a note and say checklist in your subject line, I'll send it out to you. And it is .co is my email. But really, I walk through all this so that you can print it out. You can throw it on a bulletin board. You can bring it to Health and Safety Committee to just have a conversation and say, are we doing everything that we can to support our people along this whole broad reaching continuum? So with that, I'll turn it back to Donna. And if there's any questions, or I'm happy to chat.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was a lot of really good information. We greatly appreciate it. And questions are coming in. I would just remind the attendees, if you do have a question, to put them in the Q&A feature, and we will try to get to them. So Alex, the first question is, prior to an incident, not after, what are some things that organizations can positively promote utilizing professional resources or even professional counseling? Should it be included as part of safety training or toolbox talks? What have you seen to be the best practices to promote utilization of these resources?
Yeah, so I think, and I've just pulled up the chat as well, because that's a very great in-depth question. And I think one of the things here is positively promoting, it all comes back to buy-in. So if you have the best safety plan in the world, but you have poor organizational culture, people may not be as quick to either follow up on the safety protocol or really embody it themselves. And so it's continually really talking about these safety or professional resources and counseling, as part of your training or your tool talks, because I think it's introducing it in more neutral territory so that people are aware of those resources. So training or toolbox talks. And it's not something that's just thrown at them in the middle of an incident. And a lot of people, when it comes to our mental health, we don't talk about it a lot as a society. And so when it comes to professional help, people may have various levels of comfort of to talk about it. So if we keep integrating it into the conversation in those earlier stages, it helps to normalize it a little bit more. And that's, I'd say, the best practice is normalizing mental health in a way that people can have those conversations and not feel as though, it's just being thrown at them in a certain incident.
Another question, God forbid, should there be a fatality and, that work crew goes off of the road, but you have to send another crew out there because the work has to continue. What do you say to that crew to make them comfortable, going out to do work when they know that one of their colleagues have just been killed? What do you do? How do you manage that?
Yeah, so I think, that's a tricky one, and I'd be really interested to know from some of our colleagues, their thoughts on that. But I'd say the first thing is working with your enforcement, with emergency services, and having confidence that that is now a safe work zone to reopen. And so, what are we doing to protect our people? So, is it validating with enforcement and emergency services that yes, it is safe? Is it bringing in more crash attenuation trucks? Is it expanding the work zone closure area or extending it on either end, or sorry, on the sort of the approach side of the traffic closure? So what supports can we do to remove people or protect people? And then having a conversation with them about, this is where we're at. This is what's happened. We have our training, and we've taken these approaches. And so it kind of comes back to that hierarchy of health and safety to mitigate the risk, but we're still in a learning phase now. And I would say the other thing is give your employees choice to go in and if they want to finish that job or not. People need to be able to make that decision. And what you do as their leadership is you give them the most amount of information that you can, and you give them, your knowledge and your affirmations that you've done everything possible to remove them from risk while there's an investigation and changes to protocol that are still ongoing.
That's some really good information, Alex. Thank you so much. Again, if there's any other questions, put it in the Q&A feature. Alex, we are getting a lot of requests for your checklist, and I'm sure you want to send those out to the individual so you can follow up with them. But if you'd like to share that with me, I'm happy to send it out to like our council and others if you'd like.
Yeah. I'll send that to Donna, and then also just because we may lose these folks in the chat. So if people want to just send me a note, then I'm happy to send it to them as well, but also to Donna too.
That's great. I'm really looking forward to our next webinar in the series, which is on September 13th. And that topic is creating a safety culture. So a lot of good information today. I know that the next one is really going to follow up on some of this really good information. So I'm looking forward to it. You guys make sure you mark your calendars and be on the lookout for the registration link. It'll be coming shortly. And we definitely hope you will join us for the next one. Please take a few minutes to fill out the survey, which will pop up on the screen here shortly. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Alex, for your time and all this great information that you're sharing with us. We greatly appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day and stay safe.